Hello, I'm presenting you Inside Paulo Freire. Hope you enjoy. So, my goals and objectives are to introduce a theorist who philosophical ideas, introduce pedagogy and education. I would like to increase the awareness of social and educational and economical injustices and apply theoretical concepts through an understanding of the individual differences. I also would like to increase the understanding of importance of nutrition in early brain development, and I would like to increase the awareness of the banking model in education as a means to change it to a more nutritionist approach. So I'm going to recap a bit about who Paulo Freire is. So Paulo Freire was born and raised in Northeast Brazil. His early life experiences made him realize how different he was socially, economically, and how this affected the way he intook knowledge. His family was a middle class income family, and they lost their social economic base because he had to move to a poor town, and where he had to sometimes steal chickens from the neighbors just so that his family could eat. And this was a major connection for me as I had a similar experience as a child. My family also came from a middle income family, and we went through a recession in 1996 where my dad lost his job and we had to move to a low income neighborhood. I also saw the differences, and I was exposed to many things that I wouldn't have if my dad had not lost his job. And so this made a real impact as there was days that we did not have food, like Paulo Freire. And I had a proud mom who would not get a hand me down, so my mom was opposed to getting welfare, and as a result, we suffered. And I just wanted to talk about how this contributes to my degree, and how Paulo Freire and how important nutrition and actually proper nutrition, how it contributes to, early childhood development. So I wanted to share this article that relates to development in the brain. So, according to Bonzik and Costello 2017, 90% of neural connections are formed by the age we are 5, which influence emotional development, health, academic, and social development. So, I want to take a moment and teach you a little bit about how our brain works and how nutrition and brain development and how it relates to Pablo and me and how we were probably affected. Okay, so during infancy, in early childhood, the control center of the brain, which is the cerebral cortex, is responsible for the overproduction of the synapses. So, two factors contribute twice the amount of synapse production as we know as nature and nurture. In nature, our genes hold the responsibility of synaptic production as they hold genetic material passed down from our parents who are responsible for early targeting cues known as pheromones. So, due to the overproduction of synapses, the brain forces synapses to compete with one another, right? So, experience determines which synapses will be preserved or which will be eliminated. The environment is known as a stimulant to brain growth, and especially in children because they hear, they see, they feel, they think about everything they come in contact with. So, when a synapse is formed and it's consolidated through experiences, nurture takes over by the environment. So, repeated exposures of an experience, such as seeing, touching, and smelling, thinking, and feeling, and so on, translate into electrical activity impulse. That it impulses a synaptic growth. So, the more the experience, the better chance the synapses will stay unless they will be ignored. So, an example would be like if a child was born with a music talent passed down from mom and dad, um, they love to hear the music on the radio. So when they like music and then the dad buys them a guitar, the child begins to play with the guitar, touches and sees it, and he thinks about how to use it and what it does. Then the child begins to learn how to play with the experience. The child continues to learn about music. And then with the genes passed down from the dad, it is now being nurtured by its environment. So they are likely to continue to like playing music, and as long as he practices it, he's gonna make these synaptic connections, and with time, it becomes he becomes the child becomes a master of music. So this is of our ability as adults to learn new things. We must continue to learn as adults, and we can continue to create synaptic connections. So we should begin really early in our childhood by exposing ourselves to enriched environments so that we can have large cerebral cortexes and keep as many synaptic connections. We should continue this into adolescence and when we get into adulthood because it it creates more creativity. For myself, I like to play word games on my phone once a week to keep my mind sharp. So now I would like to take a moment to actually explain what we're seeing on the screen here. And it's just a little bit of anatomy of the neuron, which it took me time, a couple of times, to learn about what each represents, but it's very important because it's going to lead to the next slide. So the dendrites are going to be those branch-like structures that arise from the cell body. They receive an input from intercellular space, including chemical and those electrical signals from one neuron to the other neuron. So the tree-like structure of the dendrite enables the neuron to receive and integrate input from a relatively large neighborhood. So these neurons typically have about 6,000 to 10,000 dendrites. The cell body, which is the largest part of the neuron, it contains the nucleus in the center of the neuron, which contains the chromosomes. So, like I was explaining, the dad's genes. The soma of the neuron, essentially, those chromosomes contain a person's genetic material, like the dad's, that likability of music or that talent of music. It processes including transcription and the translation of genes, assembly modification of proteins. This all takes place in the soma. So the body or the soma where the incoming signals get processed and sent out to a person's genetic makeup can influence this process. Like I was mentioning about the dad's talent, it influences this production of the neuron. So the axon is that long, slender structure which arises from the soma and it outputs the structure of the neuron. So this is actually where the electric is going to shoot out from. So the initial segment of the axon, where the axon connects to the soma, is the place where we would find the action potential. This is where it's initiated. So that what is an action potential? So it's an electrical spike. It's an impulse that carries the message through the axon, carried by the dendrite and along through the action potential. So the axon carries the action potential away from the soma, and it's kind of like a chain link structure, and it transmits the signal to the other cells. So this is where it gets very, very, very interesting. The myelin, which is on the right side of your screen, is that fatty white substance that surrounds the axon of some nerve cells, forming an electricity insulating layer. So this is essential for proper functioning of the nervous system and is an outgrowth of the type of cilia gel. So the production of the myelin sheath, the protective coating, is called myelination. So in humans, myelin begins in early third trimester when a woman is pregnant. And although the myelination exists in the brain at the time of birth, infancy myelination occurs very quickly, leading to a child's fast development, including walking, crawling. So in the first year, myelination continues through the adolescent stage of life. So without myelination, sensory and motor signals are poorly conducted. So what this means is the electrical charge of the action potential doesn't make it through the axon or the signal gets lost. This is what happens in diseases like multiple sclerosis or demyelination in the axon. And which is very, very important. This is going into my next slide. So my next slide is going to be food for the brain. So what happens what I just presented about the myelination and the synaptic connections? Food contributes to myelination. So because of the rapid growth in the first year of life, the brain actually triples in size from the day you're born all the way to your first birthday. And 50% of those calories during that time are intook from fat. So the myelin sheath that surrounds that insulates the axon, it's contributed by omega-3 fatties. So for me as a mom and a first-time mother, and like many people who are probably not very familiar with nutrition, when we think about fat, sometimes we're not thinking about the proper fat. So we're thinking like hamburgers or, I mean, that's what I thought, chips, and that's not proper nutrition. So, with my research, I found this article that told me ideas that do contain the omega fatty acids that I want to present to you all today. So, these foods include salmon, tuna, enriched eggs, dairy products, olive oil, canola oil, flax seeds, legumes, and black beans. And I wanted to present this because I think that it's so important to increase the awareness of the proper food or proper nutrition intake, because like even with my daughter, she has a dietary restrictions. She can't have eggs and she can't have dairy, cheese, and certain nuts. So I don't give her any nuts. And honestly, out of this, there's a couple that she can't have. However, she's able to have salmon, so I make her rice and salmon and I mix it, and she loves it. And I'll make her like a pasta that doesn't contain egg, and I'll put olive oil and flaxseed. And I was really really lucky because she likes beans, so I'm able to give her black beans and she likes it as well. And the thing about it is like for cultures like myself or people like me, my mom, because she was probably a minority in a low income family, she wasn't exposed to some of these foods. So I think for me, it's very important to increase the awareness and to teach parents about proper food nutrition, because it does affect brain development, and it's super crucial in even that first year of life when your brain is tripling. That's important. Children need to have proper nutrition during that time. And I was having these conversations with my sister, my older sister, and my mom, and I'm like, how did we even know we were deficient? Like, how do you know your children are deficient? And you don't know they're deficient until they're sick or something wrong is happening. So I just want to increase that awareness and education, and I don't know, eventually work maybe in pediatrics or something, where there should be some kind of um, like schedule routine or some kind of checkup to see how can we measure these deficiencies, because it's very important, because poor nutrition over a period of time can lead to a health condition known as malnutrition. So as a child who went through that recession and there was months that I didn't have proper nutrition because we were just getting by, just like Paulo Freire did, what kind of damage did that have? What are my long lasting effects? And so how many children in this world uh, do not have the proper nutrition intake? And this affects our learning that I just presented. It talks about the synaptic connection. Had we had the proper nutrition, had I strengthened those connections, could I be smarter? Could I be healthier? Could I have prevented so many illnesses? Those are the questions that I pose. And so we're going to move on. So Paulo Freire was a grammar teacher while he was in high school, and he went on to marry an elementary teacher, and he also had 5 children, of 3 of them which became educators. So this is important because he mentions that his work as a teacher is what gave his influence credit. The role of an educator is to understand and become a part of a learner's culture, is what he says, because it stimulates learning and increases the power in the individual. That's what Paulo Freire stated. And what I believe, Paulo didn't just preach what he said, he also practiced what he preached. And he lived and breathed education, and you can see this through his family values. I believe this is very an important factor, because when you want to be a role model, people will look at you to see the effort and the example that you set. And what Paulo did was he gave his work and education credit and value. And I believe this is important because any parent who believes something is good, they will apply it to their own children. And this is why it was very extremely important for me to share with you all. And I just didn't want to like give it to you the very first time. But I believe that is true. As a parent, if I know that this application is going to be good or this class is going to be good for my kids, I'm going to let them, teach that and let them do that course. So I think this is very powerful. So moving on to the next slide. So Paulo Freire was banished from an exile from his native land because of his educational beliefs. And we'll get a little bit into that. I don't want to like just jump in right in, but I read the Pedagogy of Oppress. I just started reading it because it's a lot, but I picked two passages and I just kind of want to share them to you as an introduction about his work. So he says, thinking beings in a dialectical relationship with an objective reality upon which we act, being aware, knowing, and understanding what they know. Second passage. First world progressive educators who remain chained to the mystification of the methods, reductions of conscientious techniques in Latin American education in adult learners. And I want you to just sit there and think about what I just said. So, Paulo Freire is saying you cannot have an education without politics. And what I believe he's saying, which I'm pretty sure because I'm at that part reading in that chapter, and he's basically stating, as educators, how can we teach children, or how can we teach anybody knowledge without them knowing their actual position around that surrounds that knowledge? And then he talks about first world progressive educators that remain chained to this oppression, or maybe ignorance that is actually there. So that way it's almost like a chain link of effects. It just never frees open because there's just a repeated pattern of ignorance, or maybe people don't want to talk about it. Oh, it doesn't exist. And so he presents this meaning of conscientization process, which is that active reality, which I will get into a little bit deeper, but with this next slide. But I just want you to really think about your active reality. And I want to pose a question. What is your active reality in education? So when you learn all the materials that you're learning, how does that relate to where you are right now? And that's why I wanted to present what I did for this presentation, because Paulo Freire, I connected with him in so many levels in my early childhood, and he is now kind of aligning to what I believe in education right now too. And so I'm gonna move on to the next slide because it's gonna kind of like lead into that. So, moving on, Paulo Freire believed that there was empty words in democracy, freedom, justice, and a social state. He believed that the abuse of euphemisms distort the reality, and dominant forces such as the media, political, and those from the educated class, those elite members of society, distract the reality of what's actually really going on and widening the income gap. When I read this, I couldn't help to really think about my reality, our reality. And when I think about freedom, where we come from, yes, we are free compared to other countries, but yet we are still living in a country where we are restricted, right? And there's a big dilemma going on right now about the mass situations, and I really don't want to get too much into that, but it's still occurring, right? And he's talking about this income gap. And the one thing that comes into mind is that men and women have that gender gap of income. So men make more income wages than women. And yet we consider ourselves to be in a justice and social state. Again, the problems with the Black Lives Matter and police. These are obvious things that are occurring in our everyday life, yet we live in a free and democracy state. And so what I think Paulo didn't want to transfer his beliefs. I don't necessarily want to say that. I'm just saying These are active realities that we should be talking about. They're obvious, they're all over the media. Um, there's times where I can't even talk to certain friends because they are so influenced by the media, and it's really hard for me to be like, well, don't believe everything that you see and hear, and I'm just, I guess I consider myself to be, you know, the elite, the educated, because I do know that not everything in the media is real, right? And I know that not all the studies that I'm going to pull out from scholarly articles are going to be, supported, right? So I'm going to move on with that, with saying that his book actually was banned from schools because schools thought that we shouldn't teach children that they should be oppressed. But that was their trans, like, what they thought the book meant, when the actual book really didn't mean that. He just was saying, be aware of your active reality. So if the schools felt that way, maybe there was an underlying issue. Maybe he didn't say we're oppressed, but he's saying, what's your active reality? So I want to leave that with you, and think about what is your active reality. And I'm going to be moving on to the next slide, which is uh, Paulo Freire's The Banking Model of Education and what he thought of. So he proposed that the banking model education was a process in which education becomes an act of depositing the students with knowledge. They become depositories and the teachers become depositors. And we can all agree with this, right? In the teacher directed classrooms. So basically, students receive and memorize and repeat. That's what we do when we go to school. We take notes, we learn, and then we take tests and we repeat that. However, Paulo felt that it only extends to only receive, fill, and store and deposit and nothing more. And he felt like this was lacking. So he wanted, this is when I was talking about like higher education is only accessible to the rich, and how this process is seen to domesticate students to the social order, creating a social gap. And he talked about quality or quantity over quality in the state of education. And I wanted to touch a little bit about that, about in the present reality, in my active reality, and how this is true. So higher education is only accessible to the rich. Now, a master's degree isn't cheap. So maybe there are students out there whose parents can afford their children to go to school. But for myself, I'm going to have a load of student loans, and I'm going to have to go get a job and pay those student loans off before I can actually make money. Um, and the quantity over quality, I mean, we talk about this all the time. So if you have a goal, say my goal now is to have a PhD degree, I'm going to have to pay off my student loans before I can go and move on to a PhD degree, or I can just keep accumulating. I feel sometimes that I'm just a number, right? And how many of us, especially after a pandemic, are we going to have a job when we graduate? Are we, was this degree really worth it? Now, I'm only asking this in relationship to what I just proposed as far as quantity over quality. I think for myself, knowledge is very powerful. That's something no one could ever take, regardless of a job. I am very glad that I went to school and I'm finishing with my master's degree. And yes, a PhD degree is in my future, but I want to be able to take a moment, be with my family, and as a woman, I have so many roles that it's hard to give 100% in all my roles. And I feel like for 6 years, I've been a little bit selfish, and that I need to really focus on my child who is 3 years old and needs me. So, like Freire proposed, that this banking model of education is lacking, and he wanted to propose a nutritionist banking approach. What this means is he wanted to feed the brain of understanding, creating critical thinking, and that's where um, that creative thinking that he was talking about, that active reality, that raising the awareness, the consciousness of your active reality, what you do with the knowledge that is being banked into you, right? It's not just being banked and deposited. Like you need to withdraw the information and apply it into your everyday. So what are you doing with what are you learning today? And I think it's just really important as a student to really take in that information that a teacher teaches you, and really apply it to your everyday life. And so he also believed that education was political, like I said before, and one must respect the opposing side. So, like, when I first started reading his book, I thought, oh man, it's really political, but that's not what like, how I interpreted wrong. So, you know, he didn't want to push his beliefs onto people. He was just saying, be aware of your surroundings, of the things that are your reality, whatever that might be, whether you're a Democrat or a liberal or Republican, whatever it might be, just take that, just creative and think about what's going on. And I really, really respect that for what he was talking about. So, moving on to the multiple intelligence theory and how it applies to Paulo Freire. I think that Gardner's theory of multiple intelligence does align with Paulo Freire because he was able to be empathetic for other people. How he said, teaching is respecting other people's cultures. And so that contributes to the individual differences of how they intake knowledge and how they learn. So, the different intelligences: music, bodily, kinesthetic, logical, mathematic, linguistic, spatial, interpersonal, intrapersonal, naturalistic. And how I applied it to my presentation was that talent of music, and how genes sometimes are transmitted through, the talent is transmitted through, genetic material passed on from your parents. And I think that applies to it 100%. Um, and I believe that Paulo Freire would agree 100% that, people do learn differently, and some people may be good at many things. You could be active and play a bunch of instruments and be very good at talking to people. For me, I love social emotional development. I love interpersonal and intrapersonal skills. I find it amazing to have a conversation with somebody. So I really love Gardner's multiple intelligence. I think it's a great theory, and it does align to how Paulo thinks. And lastly, I just wanted to bring in Bloom's taxonomy of cognitive domain and how I apply it to Paulo Freire, which I 100% can agree. Creating, evaluating, analyzing, applying, and understanding and remembering aligns with his critical thinking and this raising awareness in adult literacy, and how it pertains to effective technology. I had to use these steps in order for this presentation to run it smoothly. So I just want to say that I had an amazing time presenting this. This was something I'm very, very passionate about. I want to one day create workshops so I can increase the awareness with parents and students about the importance of brain development and proper nutrition and synaptic connections and social emotional development, especially after a pandemic that created social distancing. I just have so much to share. I'm so grateful for running into Paulo Freire. I was introduced to him, thankfully, this semester, and there was just so many connections that I had with him, especially early childhood, and how that pertains to my passion and what I want to do with my life and my education. And I just think that having tools like Bloom's taxonomy is only going to make you more effective as an instructor, and just really increasing that creative in your students is a very powerful tool. I just want to be able to continue contributing, kind of like Paulo did, and in that sense, you never really stop learning, even as an adult, and we can all relate being graduates. So I just want to give you the thanks for this amazing semester, and I learned so much, and I'm very appreciative of everything. I hope you really enjoyed this. Thank you so much. Bye bye. One last thing, my references in case you wanted to look. Thank you. Bye.